when the billionaire Pendleton family banished their widowed daughter-in-law to a charred, worthless patch of dirt in the Sierra Nevada mountains, they thought they had buried her. They didn't realize they had just handed her the keys to a $50 million empire hidden right beneath the ashes. The rain hammered against the floor-to-ceiling windows of Whitman, Hayes and Croft, blurring the panoramic view of the San Francisco skyline. Inside the mahogany-paneled conference room, the air was suffocatingly dry, heavy with the scent of expensive leather and unspoken hostility. Harley sat at the far end of the massive table, her black morning dress feeling entirely too thin. She was 42, exhausted, and completely alone. Just 3 weeks ago, she had a husband. Aidan Pendleton had been the love of her life, a man who had defied his fiercely aristocratic family to marry a public school history teacher. But a sudden violent squall off the coast of Monterey had capsized Aidan's sailboat. The ocean had returned his body, but it had taken Harley's future. Across the table sat Beatrice Pendleton, Aidan's mother. Beatrice was a woman carved from ice and old money, her posture impossibly rigid, a string of flawless South Sea pearls resting against her collarbone. Beside her was Ryan Aidan's younger brother, a man whose perfectly tailored Italian suit couldn't hide the predatory gleam in his eyes. "Let us proceed, Mr. Croft," Beatrice said, her voice barely above a whisper, yet it commanded the room. "I have no desire to prolong this unpleasantness." Thomas Croft, a senior partner with silver hair and a perpetual grimace, adjusted his reading glasses. He cleared his throat, looking everywhere but at Harley. "As you wish, Mrs. Pendleton. We are here to execute the final will and testament of Aidan James Pendleton." Harley gripped the edges of her chair. Aidan had always assured her that if anything happened to him, she would be taken care of. He had built his own fortune in commercial real estate, completely separate from the Pendleton family's generational shipping wealth. To my mother, Beatrice, and my brother Ryan, Croft read his voice, droning in the quiet room. "I leave my shares in Pendleton Maritime, returning them to the family trust. Furthermore, I bequeath the Pacific Heights estate and all liquid assets within my primary accounts to the Pendleton Vanguard Trust to be managed by Ryan Pendleton." Harley's heart stopped. The Pacific Heights estate, that was their home. The accounts, that was everything. "Wait," Harley interrupted, her voice trembling. "There must be a mistake. Aidan and I—" "There is no mistake, Harley," Ryan sneered, leaning forward. Aidan finally saw sense in his last months. He recognized that family assets belong with the family, not with a temporary distraction. "Continue, Mr. Croft," Beatrice commanded, not even looking at Harley. Croft swallowed hard. "To my wife, Harley Hughes Pendleton, I leave the entirety of the Oakhaven tract, specifically the Bishop's Peak cabin property in the Sierra Nevadas and its immediate surrounding acreage, and nothing else." The room went dead silent. Harley felt the blood drain from her face. The Bishop's Peak cabin. It was an old rustic retreat Aidan's eccentric great-grandfather had built in the 1920s. But that wasn't the tragedy. The tragedy was that just 3 months ago, the catastrophic creek fire had swept through that exact ridge. The cabin had burned to the ground. The land was decimated, covered in toxic ash, entirely uninsurable and virtually unsellable. Aidan had left her a pile of charcoal. "He left me a burnt-down cabin," Harley whispered, the reality crashing down on her. "I have $40 in my checking account. How am I supposed to live?" Beatrice stood up, smoothing the front of her skirt. She finally met Harley's eyes, and the sheer malice in the older woman's gaze was breathtaking. "That is not our concern. Aidan realized his mistake before he died. He knew you belonged in the dirt, Harley. And now he's given you a patch of it." You have 48 hours to vacate the Pacific Heights house. Change the locks on Thursday, Ryan." They walked out, leaving Harley alone with the lawyer, the rain, and a piece of paper, declaring her the sole owner of a wasteland. For 2 days, Harley lived in a blur of packing boxes and tears. She loaded whatever she could fit into her beat-up Subaru Outback clothes, a few books, and the few meager possessions she had brought into the marriage. When the Pendleton estate managers arrived with a locksmith on Thursday morning, she drove away without looking back. She spent her first night in a cheap motel off Interstate 5, staring at the popcorn ceiling. She felt utterly betrayed. Had Aidan really turned on her? Had his family coerced him into changing the will, perhaps leveraging some secret against him? It didn't make sense. The Aidan she knew was kind, fiercely protective, and deeply cynical about his family's greed. The next morning, with no job, no home, and her bank account dwindling to nothing, Harley looked at the deed on the passenger seat, the Oakhaven tract. Bishop's Peak. She had nowhere else to go. With a tank full of gas and a heavy heart, Harley pointed her Subaru east toward the jagged snow-capped teeth of the Sierra Nevada mountains. She needed to see it. She needed to stand in the ashes of the only thing her husband had left her and say goodbye. The drive up the winding mountain roads was treacherous. The lush greenery of the lower elevations soon gave way to a skeletal landscape. The aftermath of the creek fire was a haunting sight. Thousands of charred ponderosa pines stood like blackened toothpicks against the grey sky. The smell of wet ash and scorched earth still lingered in the damp mountain air, a grim reminder of the inferno that had consumed the ridge. Harley's tires crunched over the gravel as she pulled up to a set of warped, heat-buckled iron gates. Beyond them lay the remains of the Bishop's Peak cabin. She stepped out of the car, pulling her wool coat tight against the biting mountain wind. The devastation was absolute. Where a grand 3-story timber and stone lodge once stood there was now only a gaping crater of debris. The massive river-stone chimney was the only thing still standing, towering over the rubble like a lone gravestone. Harley walked slowly through the ruins, her boots kicking up plumes of grey dust. Melted glass from the windows pooled over the stones like frozen water. Twisted metal pipes jutted from the earth. The heartbreak was physical. She sank to her knees in the dirt, the cold seeping through her jeans, and finally let out the agonizing sobs she had been holding in since the lawyer's office. She cried for Aidan. She cried for the life that was stolen from her. She cried until her throat was raw and her eyes were swollen shut. When the tears finally stopped, the silence of the mountain settled around her. Harley wiped her face, smearing ash across her cheek. As she pushed herself up, her hand brushed against something hard and unnaturally smooth beneath the layer of soot. She paused. It wasn't stone. Curious, Harley used her boot to scrape away a thick layer of wet ash and charred debris near the base of the massive stone hearth. The heavy slate roof of the cabin had collapsed here during the fire, forming a protective tent over a small section of the original floor. Beneath the ash lay a section of thick, wide plank oak floorboards. They were scorched black, but miraculously intact, and embedded in the center of the wood, flush with the floor, was a heavy brass ring. Harley's pulse quickened. A trapdoor Aidan had never mentioned a basement. The cabin sat on solid mountain rock. She grabbed the brass ring and pulled. It didn't budge. The heat of the fire had warped the wood, sealing the iron hinges shut. Refusing to be defeated by a piece of floor, Harley ran back to her Subaru, dug through the trunk, and pulled out a heavy steel tire iron. She returned to the hearth, jammed the flat end of the tire iron into the seam of the trapdoor, and threw her entire body weight against it. The wood groaned. She pushed harder, her muscles burning, biting her lip until she tasted blood. With a violent crack, the warped wood splintered, and the heavy trapdoor tore free, flipping backward onto the ash. A gust of stale, cool air wafted up from the darkness. Harley clicked on her heavy-duty camping flashlight and pointed the beam downward. There were concrete stairs leading into the earth. It wasn't just a root cellar. The walls were lined with reinforced steel. Her breath catching in her throat, Harley carefully descended the narrow steps. The air grew colder, smelling of dust and old paper. At the bottom of the stairs, the flashlight beam hit a solid wall of metal. It was a massive vintage Mosler bank vault door, painted a faded olive green, complete with a heavy steel wheel and a brass combination dial. Harley stared at it in disbelief. What was a commercial bank vault doing beneath a remote hunting cabin? She walked up to the heavy door. There was a piece of white cardstock taped above the dial. Harley reached out her fingers, trembling as she pulled it free. It was a note written in Aiden's unmistakable hurried scrawl. "My dearest Harley, if you are reading this, the worst has happened, and my mother and brother have done exactly what I expected them to do. They think they've left you with ashes. They don't know that the ashes are just the roof. The combination is the date we met, followed by the date I knew I loved you. Forgive me for the secrecy. I had to make sure they couldn't track it. It's all yours now." Tears welled in Harley's eyes, but this time they weren't tears of sorrow. A fierce, burning spark of vindication ignited in her chest. Aiden hadn't abandoned her. He had outsmarted them all. Her hands shook as she reached for the brass dial. The date we met. September 14th. September 14th. The date I knew I loved you. He had always told her it was New Year's Eve of that same year. December 31st. She spun the dial carefully. 0, 9, 1, 4, 1, 2, 3, 1. She grabbed the heavy steel wheel and pulled. For a terrifying second, it held fast. Then, with a deep mechanical clunk that echoed in the small space, the internal locking bars retracted. The massive vault door, perfectly balanced on its century-old hinges, swung open with barely a whisper. Harley stepped inside, shining her flashlight into the darkness. She found a heavy switch on the wall and flipped it. A row of battery-powered LED construction lights flickered to life, illuminating the room. Harley dropped her flashlight. It clattered against the concrete floor. The room was roughly 20 feet by 20 feet. Stacked against the left wall, reaching nearly to the ceiling, were dozens of olive-drab military surplus footlockers. Against the right wall sat a row of antique glass-front display cabinets. Harley walked on trembling legs toward the nearest footlocker. The heavy iron latches were unsealed. She flipped them open and threw back the lid. The dull, mesmerizing glow of solid gold reflected in the harsh LED light. The trunk was packed to the brim with heavy rectangular gold ingots. But these weren't modern bank bars. They were stamped with the assayer marks of the 1850s California gold rush. Harley, a history teacher, recognized the stamp immediately. Kellogg and Humbert, San Francisco. A single one of these historical ingots was worth a fortune to collectors. There were at least 50 of them in this trunk alone. Gasping for air, Harley stumbled toward the glass front cabinets. Inside, nestled on velvet cushions, were rows of pristine, uncirculated coins. The labels beneath them read like a fever dream from Stack's Bowers galleries or Sotheby's. 1884 trade dollars, 1907 ultra-high relief double eagles, a complete set of 1854 S-quarter eagles. These weren't just coins, they were holy grails of numismatics. A single 1907 ultra-high relief double eagle had recently sold at auction for nearly $3 million. Harley was looking at a dozen of them. On a small metal desk in the center of the room sat a leather-bound ledger. Harley opened it. The first entry was dated 1924, written by Aiden's great-grandfather, Harrison Pendleton. It detailed the systematic siphoning of the family's wealth converting cash into untraceable hard assets, rare artifacts, and bearer bonds, burying them far away from the prying eyes of the newly formed IRS, and more importantly, away from his own greedy heirs. Aidan had found it, and he had legally transferred the deed of the land and everything beneath it to Harley right before his death. She had been tossed out into the cold with $40. She was currently standing in a room holding an estimated $50 million in untraceable tax-free historical wealth. Suddenly, the absolute silence of the underground vault was broken. Above her, muffled but distinct through the open trap-door, came the heavy crunch of gravel. A vehicle was pulling up to the ruins, then the heavy thud of a car door slamming shut. Harley's blood ran cold. She was miles from civilization, alone standing over a fortune, and she could hear footsteps walking through the ashes, heading straight for the hearth. Harley's heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. The heavy crunch of footsteps echoed from above, moving methodically through the debris. Someone was up there, and they were heading straight for the massive stone hearth. She lunged for the wall switch, slamming her palm against it. The harsh LED construction lights died instantly, plunging the subterranean vault into absolute suffocating darkness. Harley backed away from the entrance, her boots making no sound on the concrete floor, until her spine pressed against the cold steel of the military footlockers. She slipped her trembling hand into her coat pocket, her fingers finding her smartphone. She blindly navigated the screen, relying on muscle memory, to open the voice memo app and pressed record. Above her, a voice cut through the mountain wind, a voice dripping with aristocratic arrogance that made Harley's blood run instantly cold. "I don't care what the county surveyor said, Caldwell. Find the anomaly. Aidan wasn't a fool. He wouldn't have deeded this specific patch of dirt to that pathetic woman unless the asset was physically here." It was Ryan Pendleton. Another voice, gruff and out of breath, replied, "Mr. Pendleton, the fire wiped out all the topographical markers. We are practically sifting through a landfill. Are you certain the old man's ledger was accurate? My great-grandfather was a paranoid eccentric, but he kept meticulous records." Ryan snapped his voice, growing dangerously close to the trapdoor opening. "The corporate accounts at Pendleton Maritime are bleeding out. We are 3 weeks away from federal insolvency. Aidan knew it. He found the physical reserve, and instead of saving his own family, he tried to hide it for his little charity case of a wife." There was a sudden, sharp pause. "Sir," Caldwell said, his voice dropping an octave. "Look. The ash has been cleared. The trapdoor is broken open." "Get the flashlights," Ryan hissed. A beam of blinding white light pierced the gloom at the top of the concrete stairs. Harley pressed herself harder into the corner, clutching a heavy, solid gold Kellogg and Humbert ingot she had blindly pulled from the top trunk. It weighed nearly 3 pounds, a cold, dense weapon in her shaking hands. The two men descended the narrow stairs. Ryan stepped into the vault first. As Caldwell swept his high-powered tactical flashlight across the room, the beam caught the open footlocker, reflecting off the stacked gold. Ryan gasped, dropping his designer leather briefcase. The sheer volume of wealth practically glowed in the darkness. "Good God," he breathed, stepping toward the center of the room. He actually found it. Decades of rumors, and the bastard actually found it. "Mr. Pendleton." Caldwell warned the flashlight beam, sweeping further into the room. "We aren't alone." The light hit Harley. She stood frozen, the gold bar raised her eyes, adjusting to the blinding glare. Ryan stopped, a cruel, slow smile spreading across his perfectly manicured face. Well, Harley, I should have known you'd scurry back to the only thing you have left. Though I must admit, I didn't think you possessed the intellect to open the vault. Get out." Harley said, her voice shaking, but laced with a newfound dangerous edge. "This property is legally mine. Aidan deeded it to me. All of it." Ryan laughed, a dry, echoing sound that bounced off the steel walls. "Deeds legality. My dear, you are standing over $50 million of untraceable, unbanked historical assets. When Caldwell and I leave here with these trunks, there won't be a trace of this gold. And unfortunately for you, there won't be a trace of you either. Another tragic accident for the Pendleton family. First the husband, then the grieving widow. So poetic." Harley tightened her grip on the gold bar. The puzzle pieces violently slammed into place. The sudden squall, the perfectly capable sailor drowning in familiar waters. "An accident," Harley whispered, stalling for time, ensuring her phone was capturing every syllable. "Aidan's death wasn't an accident. Was it Ryan?" Ryan took a step closer, his ego inflating with the thrill of his own perceived brilliance. Aidan was a sentimental idiot. He discovered Pendleton Maritime was bankrupt, destroyed by my creative investments. He threatened to blow the whistle to the SEC. I begged him to give me access to great-grandfather's reserve to plug the holes, but he refused. He said the family deserved to fall. "So you killed him," Harley stated, her voice eerily calm. "I protected my legacy." Ryan spat his face, twisting with rage. "Sabotaging the keel of a sailboat is child's play, Harley. The ocean did all the hard work. And now, thanks to your little treasure hunt, you've packaged the salvation of my company perfectly for me." He gestured to the hired muscle. "Caldwell, restrain her." The massive fixer stepped forward, pulling a pair of heavy zip ties from his jacket. Harley didn't hesitate. Using every ounce of adrenaline coursing through her veins, she hurled the 3-pound gold ingot directly at the flashlight in Caldwell's hand. The heavy bar smashed into his wrist with a sickening crunch. Caldwell screamed, dropping the flashlight. It shattered against the concrete floor, plunging the vault back into pitch darkness. "Grab her!" Ryan yelled blindly in the dark. Harley dropped to her hands and knees. She knew the layout. She remembered exactly where the heavy Mosler vault door was. She scrambled across the cold floor, dodging Caldwell's flailing boots. "Don't let her get to the stairs!" Ryan shouted, his voice echoing in the confined space. Harley's hands found the thick steel frame of the doorway. She pulled herself up, slipping out into the stairwell. She grabbed the edge of the massive olive-green vault door. "Ryan, Tor!" Caldwell yelled, hearing the hinges groan. Ryan lunged toward the doorway, just as Harley threw her entire body weight against the heavy steel. The perfectly balanced door swung shut with terrifying momentum. Ryan's hands slammed against the inside of the door just as it connected with the frame. With a deafening metallic clang, the vault sealed shut. Harley didn't stop. She grabbed the massive steel locking wheel on the outside of the door and spun it clockwise with all her might. The heavy internal locking bars engaged, sliding deep into the reinforced steel frame with a permanent heavy thud. She stood in the dark stairwell, panting, her chest heaving. From the other side of a foot of solid steel, she could hear the faint, muffled screams of Ryan Pendleton, trapped in a tomb of his own making, surrounded by the gold he had killed for. Harley practically flew up the remaining concrete stairs, bursting through the trapdoor and out into the freezing mountain air. The storm clouds had broken, and a sliver of pale moonlight illuminated the charred remains of the Bishop's Peak cabin. She ran to her Subaru, locked the doors, and cranked the heater. Her hands were shaking so violently she could barely put the car in gear, but she forced herself to breathe. She pulled out her phone and stopped the recording. 34 minutes later, Harley burst through the double-glass doors of the closest California Highway Patrol substation in the valley below. The ensuing chaos was absolute. By dawn, the isolated mountain ridge was swarming with FBI tactical units, local law enforcement, and federal forensic teams. When the FBI finally brought in a specialized safe-cracking team to drill the hinges of the Mosler vault, they found Ryan Pendleton and Caldwell shivering in the dark, surrounded by millions in historical gold. The recording Harley provided was the final devastating nail in the coffin. Ryan was immediately indicted for the premeditated murder of Aidan Pendleton, as well as federal fraud and racketeering. The investigation tore through the Pendleton family like a wildfire. Without the influx of the hidden gold, Pendleton Maritime's massive financial holes were exposed to the SEC. Beatrice Pendleton, the Ice Queen matriarch who had banished Harley to a burnt-out plot of dirt, was stripped of her remaining wealth. Her assets were frozen, her estates seized by federal creditors. She was left with absolutely nothing, forced to watch her golden child go to federal prison for life. But the most spectacular twist came in civil court. Because Aidan had legally transferred the deed of the Oakhaven tract to Harley before his death, and because the ledger inside the vault proved the assets were the personal, untaxed hoard of Harrison Pendleton, never formally integrated into the corporate trusts, a federal judge ruled that the contents of the vault were undeniably affixed to the property. They belonged entirely and legally to Harley. 6 months later, Harley stood in the VIP viewing gallery of Heritage Auctions in Dallas, Texas. She wore a stunning tailored emerald pantsuit, sipping champagne as she watched the auction floor below. "Lot 412, the auctioneer's voice boomed through the speakers. The pristine, complete set of 1854 S Quarter Eagles, a crown jewel of American numismatics. Do I have an opening bid of $2 million? Paddles shot up across the room. Harley smiled, taking a slow sip of her drink. Over the past few months, she had partnered with experts from Sotheby's and Stack's Bowers to slowly and strategically liquidate the contents of the vault. The market for mid-19th century California gold rush ingots had exploded with the sudden, verified influx of her collection. She hadn't kept all the money. In Aidan's memory, Harley established the Aidan James Pendleton Foundation, pouring millions into ocean conservation and scholarships for public school teachers. She bought back the Pacific Heights estate out of foreclosure from the bank, not to live in, but to bulldoze to the ground and turn into a public community garden. A final poetic middle finger to Beatrice Pendleton. Harley looked out over the auction floor as the gavel slammed down, securing another $5 million to her name. She had walked into a lawyer's office, a grieving, penniless widow. She had been handed a box of ashes and told to disappear. Instead, she had dug through the soot, claimed her empire, and burned their entire world down. If Harley's incredible journey from an exiled widow to a triumphant mastermind left you speechless, hit that like button. Right now, have you ever found something hidden in an old house or experienced a twist of fate you never saw coming? Let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to share this unbelievable story of revenge and fortune with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more thrilling true tales. Tap the bell icon so you never miss an update.